Welcome to the Inside Track with Barndor Strategy, making sense of British politics and public policy. Well, today on Inside Track, we're joined by Roger Evans, who's very much the in-house speaking guru for Barndor Strategy. Welcome, Roger.
Thank you, Seth. Good afternoon.
Roger, we're going to be talking about public speaking. Can you tell us what do you really look for in a strong, good public speaker?
Lots of things, and it depends on the occasion, on what the audience want, really. But you need someone who's well informed about what they can talk about. But there are lots of people out there who are very well informed, but who are frankly not very good public speakers. You need to be able to understand a complex subject and then explain it to people in a way which is concise and easy to understand and engaging, which gets support for what you're trying to do. And this is why when I help people write speeches, I very much take a structured approach, because it's important that you don't forget to do any of the right things and that you do them all in the right order.
How do very successful speakers connect with their audience and build up that rapport? I mean, is it easily or quickly done?
I think with some speakers, of course, there are expectations which are generated. So Boris Johnson, who I had quite a lot of experience of, for example, because I was his deputy mayor for a while, everyone would expect with Boris Johnson that they would get humour. And that would mean that actually he could turn up to do a speech and just say a few words and everyone would be rolling in the aisles. Now, if you or I tried that, they'd be looking at us rather vacantly. So initial expectations matter, because an audience, they want to be entertained by you. They want to be inspired by you. They know what they've gone along to hear, but it's a good thing to live up to the brand that you've got. But for most of the people I'm working with, they don't have a brand. They're starting out from scratch. So it's really important to structure a speech. I always structure speeches, every speech I've ever done, like a game of chess. So you have an opening game, a middle game, and an end game. And the purpose of the opening game, those first 5 minutes or so of a speech that you have in every single case, are to establish a rapport with the audience and to establish your authority. Because if you don't do that, then everything else you do is going to fall upon stony ground. How do you establish rapport? Humour. Sometimes, although humour only works if you're funny. If you have a piece of humour and you're not sure if it's funny, that's probably because it isn't. And the other way you do it is by talking about things which they understand and they agree with. So we like people who are like ourselves. So establish empathy with them by emphasizing the strengths that you both have. I always say when I'm talking to people about selection meetings for political parties, if you don't have anything else to talk about in the first 5 minutes, it's quite a good idea to talk about how you came to join that political party, because you don't know anything much about the people in the room, but you do know that that's an experience every one of those people will have been through. And some of them will identify with what you say, and that's a very good way to build support.
And you say there are 3 stages, and there's the first 2.
Well, the first one is the rapport building. Get that over with in a couple of minutes. The second stage, the middle game, is where you make your case. And you have to have a clear idea before you start a speech about the points you're trying to make and the arguments that you're trying to win, that you're trying to get people to buy into. And the third stage, the end game, is quite important because it's about a call to action. And certainly in politics, I don't think I've ever done a speech where there wasn't a call to action at the end of it. Maybe it's vote for me, maybe it's support this particular policy, maybe it's just get out there and campaign and be happy about it. So there's always something that you're asking people to do. And if you can structure that final couple of minutes around a call to action, you will find there are all sorts of interesting things that you can do with that to make it an attractive way to end your speech and to go out on a high with people wanting to hear more from you, which is the ideal situation for you to be in.
I've seen quite a few stodgy speeches over the years from speakers who think this is a box ticking exercise. I want to get to my case as quickly as possible. I'll tell the obligatory joke. You must have heard some pretty poor jokes over the years.
Oh, good grief. I think one of the more interesting speeches I saw from this point of view was Gordon Brown, before he was Prime Minister, when he was still Chancellor, addressing the British Retail Consortium, which was a huge audience in a ballroom in a big hotel on Park Lane. And Gordon is not someone who does humour easily, and he started with a collection of jokes which obviously some special advisor had decided would be suitable, and it was a bit grim, to be honest. Then we went on to talk about fiscal policy and the things he was doing as Chancellor, which was a bit grim as well, actually, because there were lots and lots of figures and numbers. And then at the end, he talked about his agenda for skills, and that's when he really came to life. It was that end bit of the speech that showed us why he was where he was. And perhaps if he'd had a better idea of his brand and the way he was coming across, he should have done that bit at the beginning.
Yeah, I remember Brown during the expenses scandal as Prime Minister did a sort of prime ministerial address, and he kept trying to smile at the end of every sentence, which was just deeply inappropriate to the kind of speech it was meant to be. It may well be that he'd been told by his advisors, you're not smiling enough, you need to make this a bit lighter, but there's something about time and place, and I think probably also about the messenger. You might be given a really good joke, but you might not be the right person to deliver it. It might not be synonymous with your brand.
Humour is a particularly challenging element of public speaking. If you think of public speaking as 3-day eventing, I always say to people, humour is like dressage. Every bit of your humorous anecdote or your joke needs to have the words in the right place, and even down to having the pauses in the right place. What you will find with really good stand-up comedians out there is that by and large they're not the life and soul of the party. They're people who are very focused on detail, because to build successful humour you need to spend a lot of time planning a story and rehearsing it and making it work. And even then you'll only know if it works once you deliver it to the audience. So it's tough, and a lot of people I've worked with don't do humour very well, and we tend to stay away from it because quite apart from the difficulty, the challenge of delivery, there's also the question, which is I think particularly prevalent in this day and age, of whether people may not find it amusing, may take offence at what you're saying. And certainly if you start a selection speech, for instance, with a joke and no one in the room laughs, you've then created a situation where, far from building rapport, you've dug yourself into a hole that you then have to dig yourself out of, and you might not have very long to do it.
Well, on the subject of digging into holes, I wonder if you have any particular anecdotes that come to mind over the years of horror stories, amusing cases, things like that?
Well, I think one thing that's very important is to know how much time you have available and to stick to time. A friend of mine who also teaches public speaking, he says nobody ever said that speech was too short. I wish there'd been a bit more of it.
Sure.
So it's a good idea to stick to time. I knew one person who went to speak at the Lord Mayor of Westminster's dinner, very distinguished businessman who was sitting next to the Lord Mayor when time came to speak, and he just whispered to the Lord Mayor, how long do you expect me to speak for? Which is probably something they should have worked out before this final moment. And the Lord Mayor said to him, oh, not much, sir, just 4 to 5 minutes. And he stood up and delivered his speech and sat down 45 minutes later. And that was a struggle to hold the audience. If you look at TED Talks, one of the things which they do really well is they limit the length of one of their talks to around 20 minutes. And the fact is, it's really tough to hold an audience for longer than that. People will start drifting away or talking amongst themselves. And that's a challenge because quite a lot of after dinner speeches are expected to go on for, say, 45 minutes. So if you're ever in a situation where you have to deliver a long speech like that, it can be very worthwhile to try and break it up. And rather than have the question and answer session at the end, do it after you've completed the first 20 minutes. That breaks the tempo and gives everyone in the room an opportunity to participate. Then you can do another 20 minutes summing up at the end of it.
How do you balance out the needs to be a bit improvised, a bit fluid, a bit responsive with preparation?
Right. Well, it's all about preparation. I used to do political speeches where the other side would heckle and then I would respond with some instant put down. And people would say to me, "Oh, how do you manage to be so spontaneous?" I'd say it's not me that's spontaneous, it's them that are predictable.
Yeah.
So you can plan around the audience that you have. What I generally do with a speech is get the thing written and learned first, and then add the colloquialisms in at the end. And Tony Blair used to do this quite well. So he would have phrases like, or "I'll tell you this." I mean, one thing I like particularly is I'll tell you a secret, because that makes people in the room think that you're taking them into a confidence, and then the thing you say isn't secret at all. But those little twists added into a speech make it look more conversational and more improvised.
Yes.
Even though
Wilson
you've planned the whole of the rest of the delivery. And back to time, just take a watch him with you. No one's going to be upset if you actually time the amount of time you're taking up, so that you sit down and don't overstay your welcome. I did a meeting once where I turned up with an orange plastic timepiece, which was actually a hiker's watch. It was the only thing which I could find. It was on a rope to hang around your neck and everything. And one of the people in the room said to me at the end, "What on earth is that thing that you've brought in with you?" So I said to him, "Well, it's a digital clock, because I wanted to make sure I didn't spend, as a courtesy to you, I wanted to make sure I didn't go over the 10 minutes that you gave me to speak." I said, and it happens to be a very special digital clock. It's a hiker's clock, and it's got a compass on it in case I lose my way, and a whistle on it in case I need to call for help. And fortunately, I haven't needed either of those tonight.
Well, I'll tell you one person from history who'd probably fully endorse those remarks, and that's Winston Churchill, who today I don't think people would go for Churchill's speaking style. It's a very formal, flowery, decorative style, big in the 19th century, but already quite outdated even in his own time. But Churchill was famous for rehearsing everything for days and days and days, and saying being this spontaneous requires a huge amount of rehearsal, because he would basically plan for every kind of response that he might get and then work accordingly in that way. How much do you find it helps to have a set speech with a set text compared to something a bit more fluid like bullet points to work off of, or is there a model for everything you use?
There's a model for it. I think it depends on what you're doing. If you are appearing at a select committee, or you're making a political statement where you need to get something down and you need to have absolutely every word read in for the record, then a precise speech that you've written is the most useful thing. And probably my biggest experience of that was working on European committees. So for a European committee, these are big things. There are hundreds of people in the room, all speaking different languages. And really, when you're making a statement, all you're doing is reading something into the record. So you will have earphones on for your translation and glasses on to read the paper, and you'll just read through to the end of the script to get it onto the record. And that's the ultimate in scripted speeches. And in fact, for something like that, if you start telling jokes or doing humor, you'll find it falls flat, because it takes a couple of minutes for the translator to translate your humor for the rest of the room. So you make your joke, nobody laughs, and then as you're making a serious point 30 seconds later, everyone bursts out into laughter around the room, which is off-putting. Now, other types of speeches, for an after-dinner speech or an entertaining speech or something you're doing off the cuff, you can afford to extemporize a lot more. So for something like that, you would only have bullet points. We used to work on what I call a modular speech system, where you learn passages, stories or anecdotes or policy passages, and you decide at the time you're at the dinner or the meeting which ones of them you're going to use. But I was with Boris Johnson at a dinner once, and at the end of the dinner, as we were having coffee, he just flipped over the menu and scribbled about 6 lines on
Mhm.
the back of it. And we had a BBC reporter with us who was following us for the campaign, and he said to Boris, "What's that you're writing there?" And Boris said, "Oh, that's my speech." And he stood up and proceeded to deliver a marvelous 30-minute speech based on 6
Mhm.
bullet points on the back of the sheet. But what those of us who knew him well knew was that those points were regularly used in other speeches, and what he was doing was choosing the points he was going to make and assembling them in order before he stood up to deliver the speech. So if you do a lot of speaking, that's an option that's open to you. A lot of really good speakers do that.
And the thing that I think also makes sense to be aware of is that we may not think of it ourselves because we think we know our own voices, but in a fast-paced and changing world today, your reading voice is actually very different to how you speak, as we're doing right now. And we put on a certain voice. I mean, you hear it all the time, say, when you tune into the news and they're reading an autocue, and they're really good readers of an autocue who are used to varying the pitch of their voice, but it is not how they sound in conversation.
Yeah, keeping up with an autocue is a challenge all
Sure.
of its own. But you should be aware, if you read a speech, you're not going to come across in the same way as you would be if you delivered it. Very early in my speaking career, while I was still in a debating society, I remember I went in with my speech on a set of cards, as you do. The only problem is I dropped the cards, and they were all in the wrong order. So, and this was a right old mess during my speech. So when it came to the summing up, I just stood up and rather theatrically tossed all the cards over my shoulder and delivered a summing up without them, and it was a lot better. You can have too much in the way of visual aids, for a speech. I always say minimum in the way of cards or notes, and also minimum in the way of slides or PowerPoint as well.
I mean, how much are they a help or a hindrance then, visual aids like that?
For the most part, they're a barrier between you and your audience,
Right.
which is why you should try not to use them. They also make you a bit lazy because it's what's the easiest thing to do, to explain a policy and how it works, or just to stick a slide up and say, "There you go, folks." I went to explain low emission zone to a conference of hauliers. And low emission zone is incredibly complicated. Different lorries are charged different amounts of money. There's a boundary which applies to it. It works differently at different times of the day. And I could have just stuck a slide up which said, "There, and there you go, guys." But I made a point. I said, right, I'm not going to use visual aids for this. I'm going to explain it. And that meant that I had to learn this thing. So I had to actually understand how it worked myself. But it also meant that when we took questions at the end of the session, I was actually able to deal with the questions because I understood the background and the way it was supposed to be working.
Can we talk a bit about nerves? Because I think there's a very common idea that when you get used to public speaking, you never experience this at all. And I'm sure you've had the same experience to find even the most seasoned of politicians. I remember hearing a story about how Michael Heseltine, who's a very charismatic public speaker, was seen actually visibly shaking at the dispatch box in the House of Commons when he's Deputy Prime Minister. He's still terrified after decades of doing this. So how do you help build confidence? How can you overcome nerves in that sort of way?
Well, Michael Heseltine was an exceptionally good public speaker, of course. And it just goes to show that all of us are affected to some extent. I don't think there are any shortcuts here. My advice to people is prepare. Because if you're properly prepared and you understand what you're going to say and you can deal with the background questions around it, then that level of confidence and knowledge will come across. That's not always possible. I think if you're someone who's delivering a speech maybe every 6 months to your team at work rather than a politician who's doing it every day, then you're bound to be more nervous. And because you're not doing it every day, you can afford to use body language and confidence building to some extent cover up those nerves, so it's not immediately obvious to everyone in the room. But if you're speaking on a regular basis, you can't use tricks like that. You actually have to build the confidence in at the stage you create the speech.
And in terms of the preparation, what are we talking about? I mean, familiarizing yourself with the substance of the speech as well as whatever little rhetorical flourishes, but even things like maybe researching the room or getting comfortable in the room if you can. Go there during a lunch break and just see what it feels like to be on the stage when it's empty.
It's very important, and one of the things which always surprised people a bit when I was speaking was I would turn up ridiculously early just so I could get a look around a room, even find out how the sound system's working. There's a room in London where we used to do quite a lot of speeches that was a round room, and you would actually find your voice would come back at you from the other side of the room a couple of seconds after you'd spoken, and that is tremendously off-putting unless you actually have tried it and you're familiar with the space. So you need to find out as much as possible, understand where the audience are sitting and preferably who's going to be sitting where, so you can address your points to them. Understand what sort of an audience it is, because as a politician, there's a world of difference between delivering a speech to a room full of political supporters you want to enthuse and delivering the same speech to a room full of people who are experts in the particular policy that you're talking about and who know more about it than you do. There are certain audiences out there that demand to be treated with respect. So when Boris Johnson turned up at the CBI and did them a speech including Peppa Pig World, it was not treated with the amusement and joy that it would have been in other places because that audience felt he was disrespecting them.
Are there particular things that you can do in terms of using the room? I'm thinking of, for example, familiarizing yourself with the schedule. Have they listened to 15 different speakers that day and at the end of the bill? I mean, is it better, generally speaking, to be early on a bill or late on a bill?
It's best to be early or late. The worst place to be is in the middle, particularly in the middle of the afternoon where it all blurs a bit and people really struggle. If you're at the end, then you can take them out on a high and it's fantastic, and you get a bit of kudos afterwards because everyone wants to be photographed with you as well. It can take you quite a long time to get out of the room. If you're at the beginning, you can actually set a really high standard by producing an excellent speech at that point, so that you go away with the full knowledge that for the rest of the day, people are going to be looking at the speakers and saying, well, that wasn't very good compared to what we heard this morning, was it?
We've talked a bit about preparation. Is there a right level of rehearsal for something like a big speech?
Yeah, you can over-rehearse after a while. It's like writing documents as well. There comes to a point with editing or rehearsing where you're disimproving what you've got rather than improving it.
Yeah, I mean, the historical case that comes to mind is 1984 and Ronald Reagan. He did 2 presidential debates against Walter Mondale, and actually he's widely thought to have lost the first one, because he said with hindsight afterwards, I was over-rehearsed, I was over-prepared, I was sounding robotic and just sort of going through the motions. And so he made a point, having done all the rehearsal, of not rehearsing too much ahead of the second one, and that's where he came up with this wonderful impromptu line about not exploiting for political purposes his opponent's youth and inexperience.
The thing about good lines is they can come to you anytime. So you can actually, even while you're kind of sitting there just waiting for the speech to begin, you can suddenly think of something that comes to you and you can add it in. It's a good idea just to keep a notebook with you at all times if you do this regularly, because you can scribble things down.
And Reagan was a great collector of jokes on cards, and they were really old gags. Some of them were incredibly corny, but that was part of the whole appeal.
Yeah, and if you went to see Reagan, you wanted to be entertained and amused, so you would laugh at that stuff, whereas if it was someone else delivering it, you might not. So it's important to know what the audience are there for and what they want.
And for jotting things down, is note-taking a useful skill in terms of adjusting to your audience, or is it a distraction if you're doing it too much? Or
Well, I wouldn't do it once you've actually stood up and started to deliver. For questions, it can be useful, particularly if you have other people in the room who are asking questions. That just gives you a little bit of time to see what they're saying, make sure that you're not repeating what they're saying and that you're questioning their responses where necessary or adding to them where necessary. So a little bit of note taking helps at that point, but nothing copious.
And I want to ask a bit about the way that different audiences match a particular kind of speech. I mean, let's say a big set piece party conference speech, for instance, how that audience would have very unusual demands or particular demands.
Well, I think the thing about a party conference speech is you're speaking to two audiences for that. You are speaking to the audience in the room, and you're speaking to the audience at home on television who are going to see what you said later on. And they're also two quite different audiences, because the people in the room are diehard supporters who want to be enthused by you. People at home are probably a bit more skeptical and they want to be informed about what you're doing. So a good advisor for a speechwriter, a good speechwriter, will create a number of sound bites within the speech which will be ideal to be cut and transmitted on television, so that you get over that job for the home audience in a few lines here and there in the speech, and the rest of the speech is designed for the people in the room, because you want to get as much applause out of them.
And I think Neil Kinnock was the archetypal example of somebody who was fantastic if you're in a conference hall. You just saw this dot in the distance with flailing arms gesturing, but it looked terrible on television. But that is a really hard balance, it strikes me, to get, because I have seen, I have to say, quite a few speeches that don't do that well, and that either are too much to the audience in the conference chamber or too much to television, and they don't work for the other.
One of the things that I find a lot with people doing conference speeches is they tend to stumble over their words. And we can write that out at speech level, at design level. One of the problems is if you take a speech that someone's written and you put each sentence on a separate line, if a sentence runs over 2 lines, you've got to cut that. And if it runs over 1 line, there has to be a good reason for it. And that is because when you're delivering speech, you have to breathe. And if you have a really long line, the tendency is that you don't have permission to pause for breath until you get to the end of it. That means you're going to rush the line. That means if there are trip hazards or long words in it, you're going to stumble over them, and it's going to look pretty amateurish. So what we do is we take a line like that and we split it. If there's an and in there somewhere, we can take that out, put a full stop and turn it into 2 sentences. If there's a comma, we can do that. If there are several things in the speech which are a list, we can turn them into a list with words one on top of the other. Blair was fantastic at this, and who are we to argue with the master?
And it can be quite intimidating, just the lights. I think anybody who's used to speaking, let's say as a local councillor, a local political activist, makes lots of speeches all the time to audiences they can see, suddenly being thrust on a stage where there are so many spotlights on you, you can't see most of the audience, and you're dazzled, and that takes some getting used to.
Well, with big audiences, they can sometimes be a bit easier than small audiences, because it's rather like looking at a painting with lots and lots of faces in it, and you're much less distracted by individuals.
Yeah, I suppose even imagine your friends in the audience.
That's right. The challenge with a big audience, and I think the biggest audience I ever did was 10,000, which was Pride Day at Trafalgar Square. The challenge with a big audience like that is inertia. Because if you're going to get an audience to applaud or to laugh, it generally helps if some of the other people in the audience are doing it, because they feel like they've got permission to. So with a big audience like that, getting a reaction from them is really tough at first, simply because they're all looking at each other and thinking, what is this? Is it serious? Is it humorous? How are we supposed to respond? So it can be, big audiences are tougher to get going, but once you've got them going, they're great fun.
And for a smaller scale audience, I mean, let's say something like a selection meeting, I'm thinking your initial advice very much seems to make sense in terms of the 3 stages of speech, and particularly striking up a rapport with that audience.
Yeah, and it's important, as I said before, to talk about things that you have in common with the audience. I coached someone once who was fortunate enough to be a local candidate, and the speech was being done in the rugby club where he'd been a member. And I did say to him, is there a plaque on the wall somewhere, a list of team members which has got your name on it, and you can point to it and say, that's me there? Because nobody else at that selection would be able to do that.
Well, thank you, Roger. That's been absolutely fascinating. And don't forget to join us for the next Inside Track.
Thank you.